Hello, everyone. If you enjoy my channel, please support me with one like, one subscribe, and one share.
A yes that came too fast. Have you ever made a decision in just a few seconds and then spent months wondering if it was the biggest mistake of your life? Maybe you smiled when everyone expected you to smile. Maybe you said yes because it felt easier than saying wait. Maybe your heart moved faster than your mind. If that sounds familiar, then this story may feel very close to home. Today, I want to share a personal story. It is a story about love, fear, family, and one simple word that changed everything. That word was yes. When people watch happy couples walking through a park, holding hands under the warm American sun, they often imagine that love is simple. They imagine that two people meet, fall in love, get married, and live happily ever after. Movies love that version of the story. Social media loves it even more. But real life is usually much messier than that. Real life happens between the beautiful photos. It happens in the moments of doubt that nobody posts online. A few years ago, I was living in the United States and trying to build a new life for myself. Everything felt different. The weather was different. The food was different. Even simple conversations felt different. Some days I felt excited. Other days I felt completely lost. I was learning how to adapt to American culture while also trying to improve my English. Every day felt like a small challenge. There is something interesting that psychologists often talk about. When people enter a new environment, they naturally look for stability. They look for something familiar. They look for someone who makes them feel safe. Research shows that emotional security can strongly influence decision-making, especially during times of uncertainty. At the time, I did not know that science explained what I was feeling. I only knew that I wanted a place where I belonged. That was when I met him. The first time I saw him, nothing dramatic happened. There was no movie scene. No romantic music. No magical moment. He simply smiled and asked me a question. His voice was calm. His eyes looked kind. We talked for only a few minutes, but somehow those few minutes stayed in my mind long after the conversation ended. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. We started spending more time together. We visited local coffee shops. We walked through quiet neighborhoods. We talked about our dreams, our families, and the strange experiences of growing up in different places. Sometimes we laughed at cultural misunderstandings. Sometimes we spent hours discussing small details that probably sounded boring to everyone else. The funny thing about love is that it often arrives quietly. You do not always notice the exact moment it enters your life. One day you are simply talking to someone. The next day you cannot imagine your routine without them. That was exactly what happened to me. For the first time since arriving in America, I felt less alone. I felt understood. I felt seen. My English improved because I spoke more often. My confidence improved because someone believed in me. Even difficult days seemed easier. Looking back now, I can see something that I could not see then. I was falling in love. And maybe I was falling a little too fast. Scientists who study relationships often explain that strong emotions can affect judgment. During the early stages of love, the brain releases chemicals associated with pleasure and attachment. In simple words, love can make people feel incredibly optimistic. Sometimes it helps people see the best in someone. Sometimes it also makes them ignore potential problems. At that time, I was not thinking about science. I was thinking about him. Then one evening, everything changed. We were walking near a river just before sunset. The sky looked painted with orange and gold colors. The air felt cool and peaceful. It seemed like a completely ordinary evening. Until he stopped walking. He looked nervous. Very nervous. I remember wondering if something was wrong. Had something happened? Was he upset? Was he about to tell me bad news? Instead, he reached into his pocket. My heart immediately started racing. I suddenly understood what was happening. The world seemed strangely quiet. For a few seconds, I could hear nothing except my own heartbeat. Then he asked the question. The question that changes the direction of countless lives. The question that sounds simple but carries the weight of an entire future. Will you marry me? For a moment, my mind went completely blank. People often imagine that they will have a perfect answer ready. They imagine a beautiful speech. They imagine tears of happiness and complete certainty. But certainty was not what I felt. I felt surprise. I felt excitement. I felt fear. And I felt pressure. Not pressure from him. Pressure from the moment itself. The sunset. The emotion. The dream of a happy future. The feeling that maybe this was exactly what I had been looking for. Everything happened so quickly. Much faster than I expected. Then I heard my own voice. Yes. Just one word. One very small word. The strange part is that everyone around us seemed happier than I was. Friends celebrated. Family members congratulated us. Messages filled my phone. People called it the beginning of a beautiful new chapter. I smiled. I thanked everyone. I wore the engagement ring. I acted exactly like someone who had made the right decision. But later that night, when I was finally alone, I sat quietly in my apartment and stared at the ring on my finger. A question appeared in my mind. At first, it was only a whisper. Then it became louder. And louder. And louder. Why did I say yes so quickly? Was it love? Was it loneliness? Was it hope? Or had I just made the biggest mistake of my life? I did not know it yet, but that question was about to take me on a journey that would test my heart, challenge my beliefs, and completely change the way I understood love, marriage, and family in America. And the most surprising part of the story had not even begun. Meeting in a new city. If you have ever moved to a new place, you probably know a strange feeling that nobody talks about enough. It is possible to be surrounded by millions of people and still feel completely alone. That was exactly how I felt during my first year in America. Looking back now, I sometimes laugh at how confident I appeared on the outside. I smiled. I worked hard. I told everyone I was doing fine. But inside, I was carrying a quiet loneliness that followed me everywhere. The city around me never seemed to sleep. Cars moved constantly. Coffee shops were always busy. People walked quickly as if every second mattered. Everything looked exciting, yet I often felt like I was watching life through a window instead of truly living it. Every morning I woke up determined to improve my English. I listened to podcasts. I practiced conversations. I repeated simple phrases while walking through grocery stores. Some days were encouraging. Other days were frustrating. There were moments when I understood every word in a conversation. Then there were moments when someone asked me a simple question and my brain suddenly forgot how English worked. Researchers often explain that language learning is closely connected to emotion. When people feel relaxed and confident, they learn faster. When they feel stressed or isolated, progress can slow down. At the time, I did not know the science behind it. I only knew that some days my confidence felt strong and other days it disappeared completely. One winter morning, I looked out the window and saw snow falling for the first time in months. The street looked beautiful. White rooftops stretched across the neighborhood. Children were building snowmen. Couples walked together carrying hot drinks. It should have been a perfect scene. Instead, I felt an unexpected sadness. The weather was colder than anything I had experienced before. The sky stayed gray for days. Sunset arrived early. Even the silence felt different. Climate affects people more than they realize. Studies suggest that shorter winter days can influence mood and energy levels. When you combine a new culture, a new language, and a completely different climate, the adjustment can feel overwhelming. That season taught me something important. Sometimes what people call homesickness is not only about missing a place. Sometimes it is about missing a version of yourself that felt comfortable and confident. I missed being able to express myself effortlessly. I missed understanding every joke. I missed feeling like I belonged somewhere. Then, unexpectedly, things began to change. It happened on an ordinary Saturday afternoon. There was no dramatic setup. No romantic movie soundtrack. No mysterious sign from the universe. I was simply attending a small community event where people gathered to share food, stories, and local activities. I almost did not go. In fact, I spent nearly an hour debating whether I should stay home. Have you ever noticed how often important moments begin with decisions that seem completely unimportant at the time? Choosing one event. Taking one walk. Saying yes to one invitation. Life rarely announces its turning points in advance. When I arrived, I felt awkward almost immediately. People were talking in groups. Conversations moved quickly. Laughter filled the room. For a few minutes, I considered leaving. Then I noticed someone standing near a table of snacks. He looked relaxed, as if he belonged there without trying. While everyone else seemed busy, he looked curious. He noticed me looking around and smiled. It was a simple smile. Nothing dramatic. Yet it immediately made the room feel less intimidating. He introduced himself. I introduced myself. Then something unexpected happened. The conversation became easy. Not perfect. Not magical. Just easy. We talked about food first. Then weather. Then travel. Then culture. We discovered that we had completely different backgrounds but surprisingly similar interests. At one point, I misunderstood something he said and gave a very strange answer. Instead of laughing at me, he laughed with me. There is a huge difference. One creates embarrassment. The other creates connection. That small moment stayed in my memory. Many relationship experts talk about emotional safety. They describe it as the feeling that you can be imperfect around someone without fear of judgment. Looking back, I think that was the first thing I noticed about him. I did not feel like I needed to impress him. I did not feel like I needed perfect English. I could simply be myself. The conversation lasted much longer than I expected. Eventually the event ended. People began leaving. The room grew quieter. I assumed that would be the end of it. We would go home and continue our separate lives. Instead, he asked if I would like to get coffee sometime. It was such a simple question. Yet I remember feeling unexpectedly nervous. I said yes. Not because I thought it was the beginning of a love story. Honestly, I was not thinking about romance at all. I was simply happy to have met someone who made me feel comfortable. A few days later, we met at a small coffee shop. Then we met again the following week. And again after that. Gradually, a routine formed. We explored different parts of the city. We visited parks, bookstores, local festivals, and quiet neighborhoods. Through those experiences, I learned more about American culture than any textbook could have taught me. I learned why people loved road trips. I learned why football conversations could become surprisingly emotional. I learned that every state seemed to have its own personality. Most importantly, I learned that connection often grows in ordinary moments rather than extraordinary ones. Yet there was something else happening beneath the surface. Something I did not fully understand. Every time my phone buzzed with a message from him, I smiled. Every time we planned another meeting, I felt excited. Every time we said goodbye, I looked forward to seeing him again. At first, I ignored those feelings. Then I questioned them. Then I became curious about them. Was I simply grateful for a new friendship? Was I becoming emotionally dependent because I felt lonely? Or was something deeper beginning to grow between us? The answer seemed obvious to everyone except me. Friends started noticing. Coworkers made comments. Even strangers occasionally assumed we were a couple. I laughed every time someone mentioned it. But secretly, their observations stayed in my mind. One evening, after spending hours talking and walking through the city, I returned home and sat quietly on my couch. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding for months. What if this was becoming more than friendship? What if the person who helped me feel at home in America was slowly becoming the most important person in my life? The possibility felt exciting. It also felt dangerous. Because the stronger the connection became, the more there was to lose. And as I would soon discover, the next chapter of our story was about to move much faster than either of us expected. Love arrived faster than expected. There is an old saying that people fall in love when they stop looking for it. I used to think that was just something people said to sound wise. Then life decided to test that theory in the most unexpected way. Looking back now, I can clearly see the signs. At the time, however, I was completely unaware that I was walking straight into one of the most important chapters of my life. What started as casual conversations and simple coffee dates was quietly becoming something much deeper. The strange part was that neither of us seemed to notice exactly when it happened. There was no official beginning. No dramatic confession. No movie-style moment where everything suddenly became clear. Instead, our connection grew the way sunrise arrives. Slowly enough that you hardly notice it, yet suddenly the entire sky is bright. During those months, life in America felt different. The same streets I had walked before seemed warmer. The same coffee shops felt more welcoming. Even my daily English practice became more enjoyable because I had someone to share it with. Research in psychology suggests that positive social connections can significantly improve learning and emotional well-being. People often perform better when they feel supported and understood. Without realizing it, I was experiencing exactly that. My confidence was growing. My English was improving. My loneliness was fading. And somehow, he was connected to all of it. One Saturday morning, we drove to a small town outside the city. It was one of those spontaneous American road trips that people always talk about. We had no detailed plan. We simply picked a destination and started driving. Along the way, we talked for hours. About childhood memories. About embarrassing mistakes. About future dreams. About fears we rarely shared with other people. There is something fascinating about long drives. The road keeps moving forward, and somehow conversations do too. Maybe that is why some of the most honest discussions happen inside a car. At one point, he asked me a simple question. What do you want your life to look like 10 years from now? It sounded harmless. Yet I remember pausing before answering. Most people ask about your job, your education, your achievements. He was asking about my life. There was a difference. I told him I wanted a family someday. I wanted a home filled with laughter. I wanted meaningful relationships. I wanted peace more than success. After I finished speaking, he smiled and said something that stayed with me for a long time. That sounds a lot like what I want too. The conversation moved on. Yet those words remained in my thoughts long after the trip ended. Around that time, friends began noticing changes before I did. They would smile when his name appeared on my phone. They would ask questions that seemed strangely specific. So, how serious is this becoming? One friend asked. I laughed immediately. We're just spending time together, I replied. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew they sounded less convincing than before. Human beings are surprisingly good at recognizing patterns. Sometimes the people around us notice our feelings before we do. They see where the story is heading while we are still reading the previous chapter. As weeks turned into months, our routines became increasingly connected. We celebrated holidays together. We attended community events together. We tried new restaurants together. Some weekends we did absolutely nothing exciting at all. Surprisingly, those ordinary days became my favorite. Relationship experts often explain that lasting compatibility is not built during extraordinary moments. It is built during ordinary ones. Anyone can enjoy a perfect vacation. The real question is whether two people enjoy a boring Tuesday afternoon together. We seem to. In fact, some of our happiest memories came from simple experiences. Grocery shopping. Cooking dinner. Walking through a local park. Watching movies while arguing about which snacks to buy. None of it sounded particularly romantic. Yet all of it felt meaningful. Then something happened that made me pause. One evening, after spending the day together, I returned home and instinctively reached for my phone. I wanted to tell him something funny I had just seen. Halfway through typing the message, I realized something surprising. He had become the first person I wanted to share things with. Not occasionally. Consistently. That realization hit me harder than I expected. Because it forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding. This was no longer just friendship. Somewhere along the way, my feelings had changed. The problem was that recognizing love is one thing. Trusting it is another. Part of me felt excited. Another part felt cautious. Maybe too cautious. You see, I had witnessed relationships fail before. Friends had rushed into love only to discover major incompatibilities later. Others had mistaken attraction for commitment. Some had ignored warning signs because they wanted the relationship to work so badly. I promised myself I would never make those mistakes. Yet now I found myself wondering whether I was becoming exactly the kind of person I had warned myself about. Scientists studying romantic attachment often note that love activates reward systems in the brain. This can create powerful feelings of optimism and connection. In practical terms, love sometimes encourages people to focus on possibilities rather than risks. While that can be beautiful, it can also be dangerous if important questions remain unanswered. At the time, I was not thinking in scientific terms. I was thinking emotionally. Every day seemed to offer more evidence that we belonged together. We shared values. We respected each other. We communicated well. We laughed often. Most importantly, being together felt easy. Perhaps too easy. One evening, while walking through the city after dinner, he reached for my hand. It was such a small gesture that most people would have forgotten it immediately. Yet I remember it clearly. Not because it was dramatic. Because it felt natural. As if we had been moving toward that moment for months without realizing it. We continued walking beneath the city lights. Cars passed. People hurried along the sidewalks. Somewhere nearby, music drifted through the evening air. Everything seemed ordinary. Yet inside, something important was changing. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that included him. Not next week. Not next month. Years into the future. The image felt surprisingly real. That should have made me happy. Instead, it made me nervous. Because the more real the future seemed, the more there was at stake. What if I was wrong? What if we were moving too quickly? What if the happiness I felt was blinding me to problems I had not yet seen? Those questions lingered quietly in the background while our relationship continued growing stronger. I ignored them because everything seemed perfect. Or at least, close enough to perfect. What I did not know was that the next few months would bring a decision so sudden, so unexpected, and so life-changing that it would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about love. And once that decision was made, there would be no easy way to take it back. The ring and the first doubts. Most people think doubt arrives like a thunderstorm. Loud. Obvious. Impossible to ignore. But in my experience, doubt behaves more like a small crack in a window. At first, you barely notice it. Then one day sunlight hits it from the right angle, and suddenly you realize it has been there the entire time. That is exactly what happened after I got engaged. From the outside, everything looked perfect. I had the ring. I had the relationship. I had the future we had both imagined. Friends congratulated us. Family members celebrated. Social media transformed our engagement into a collection of smiling photos and heart-shaped comments. To everyone around us, we seemed like another happy couple moving toward a beautiful wedding. In many ways, we were. But something strange began happening after the excitement faded. Once the celebrations became less frequent and everyday life returned, I found myself paying attention to details I had previously ignored. Not because I wanted to find problems. Quite the opposite. I desperately wanted everything to be as perfect as it appeared. Yet reality has a habit of introducing itself eventually. One Saturday morning, we were discussing wedding plans over breakfast. The conversation seemed simple enough. We were talking about the guest list. Then somehow we ended up disagreeing about almost everything. How many people should attend? How much money should be spent? Whether the event should be large or intimate. The disagreement itself was not the problem. Every couple disagrees. The surprising part was how differently we approached the situation. I wanted flexibility. He wanted structure. I focused on emotions. He focused on logistics. Neither approach was wrong. Yet for the first time, I realized that compatibility and similarity were not the same thing. Before the engagement, those differences had seemed charming. After the engagement, they suddenly felt more significant. Psychologists often explain that the early stages of romance encourage people to focus on common ground. As commitment grows, differences become more visible because practical decisions begin replacing hypothetical conversations. Dating allows people to imagine a future together. Engagement forces them to start building one. That distinction became increasingly clear. A few weeks later, another moment caught my attention. We were shopping for furniture. It should have been a fun experience. Instead, it became a surprisingly complicated debate. I preferred warm, cozy spaces filled with personal touches. He preferred clean, organized designs with minimal decoration. We spent nearly 40 minutes discussing a single chair. A chair. Not a house. Not a car. A chair. At one point, I found myself wondering how two intelligent adults could invest so much emotional energy into furniture. Looking back, the chair was never really the issue. The chair represented something larger. It represented the realization that building a shared life requires thousands of small decisions. Every one of those decisions reveals pieces of who people truly are. That realization stayed with me. Then came another surprise. Before our engagement, we spent most of our time enjoying experiences together. Weekend trips. Dinners. Walks. Conversations. After our engagement, practical topics became impossible to avoid. Finances. Career goals. Long-term plans. Family expectations. Children. Housing. Insurance. Retirement. Suddenly our discussions sounded much less romantic and much more like a business meeting. At first, I found it exhausting. Then I realized something important. Love may begin with chemistry, but marriage survives through cooperation. The challenge was that cooperation is harder than chemistry. Much harder. One evening, while reviewing wedding expenses, we had our first truly serious argument. Not loud. Not dramatic. In some ways, that made it worse. The disagreement lasted hours. Neither of us raised our voice. Yet both of us left the conversation frustrated. I remember sitting alone afterward, staring at the engagement ring on my finger. For the first time since saying yes, an uncomfortable question entered my mind. Had I rushed into this? The thought shocked me. Immediately, I tried pushing it away. After all, every relationship experiences challenges. Every couple encounters disagreements. Nobody agrees on everything. Rationally, I understood that. Emotionally, however, uncertainty had already arrived. Researchers who study major life decisions often describe a phenomenon called commitment anxiety. As important milestones approach, people naturally begin evaluating risks more carefully. The closer a decision becomes to reality, the more seriously the brain examines potential consequences. In simple terms, certainty often decreases just before major commitments. Knowing that fact today is comforting. Living through it felt much less comforting. Around that time, I began noticing differences beyond practical decisions. Our daily habits were not always aligned. I liked making plans well in advance. He often preferred spontaneity. I enjoyed discussing emotions openly. He needed more time to process his thoughts. I viewed problems as conversations waiting to happen. He sometimes viewed problems as situations that needed space before discussion. None of these differences seemed catastrophic. Yet together they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. Friends continued congratulating us. Family members continued asking about wedding dates. Everyone seemed excited about our future. Meanwhile, I was quietly conducting an internal investigation. Was I seeing genuine warning signs? Or was I simply afraid of commitment? The distinction mattered enormously. Fear can disguise itself as wisdom. But sometimes wisdom disguises itself as fear. Determining which one is speaking is not always easy. One night, I searched online for advice about engagement doubts. To my surprise, thousands of people described similar experiences. Some experts explained that uncertainty before marriage is extremely common. Others warned that ignoring serious concerns could lead to future problems. The internet, as usual, offered enough conflicting opinions to confuse anyone. Instead of clarity, I found even more questions. Yet one observation appeared repeatedly. Healthy relationships are not defined by the absence of problems. They are defined by how couples handle problems together. That idea stayed with me. So I started paying closer attention. Not to whether disagreements existed. To how we responded when they appeared. Sometimes we communicated well. Sometimes we struggled. Sometimes we solved issues quickly. Sometimes we avoided them longer than we should have. Like most real couples, we were imperfect. The challenge was that perfection had quietly become my expectation. Somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that finding the right person would eliminate uncertainty. Instead, love seemed to be introducing uncertainty in entirely new forms. Then something happened that unsettled me even more than the disagreements themselves. One afternoon, while discussing future plans, he casually mentioned an idea about where he wanted to live years later. The location was completely different from what I had imagined. Suddenly I realized we had never fully discussed certain long-term expectations. We had assumed more than we had clarified. And assumptions can be dangerous. Especially when marriage is involved. That conversation ended politely. But later that night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The room was silent. The engagement ring rested on the nightstand beside me. Everyone else seemed convinced I was entering the happiest chapter of my life. Yet a growing part of me wondered whether I had overlooked something important. The most troubling question was not whether I loved him. I absolutely did. The real question was whether love alone would be enough. And as the wedding moved closer, that question became impossible to ignore. Sleepless nights and silent questions. Have you ever noticed how questions become louder at night? During the day, life keeps you busy. There are emails to answer, errands to run, meals to prepare, and conversations that demand your attention. But late at night, when the world finally becomes quiet, your thoughts often decide to become very noisy. That was exactly what happened to me. The closer our wedding day approached, the more difficult it became to silence the questions that had started appearing after our engagement. At first, those questions seemed harmless. Small. Temporary. Easy to ignore. But every week they returned, a little stronger than before. And every night they seemed to sit beside my bed, patiently waiting for me to acknowledge them. Was I truly ready for marriage? Had I said yes because I loved him, or because I loved the idea of certainty during a confusing period of my life? Was I seeing real problems, or was fear simply creating imaginary ones? The frustrating part was that I could not find a clear answer. Some mornings I woke up feeling excited about our future. Other mornings I felt nervous before my feet even touched the floor. One day I would look at my engagement ring and smile. The next day I would stare at it and feel a strange knot forming in my stomach. Psychologists often explain that uncertainty creates stress because the human brain prefers predictable outcomes. When we cannot predict the future, the brain begins generating possibilities. Unfortunately, it rarely generates only positive possibilities. It creates entire libraries of potential disasters. Evolution designed it that way to help us survive. The problem is that the same system that once protected humans from danger can also keep modern people awake at 2 o'clock in the morning worrying about situations that may never happen. My brain became very creative during those nights. What if we were incompatible in ways we had not discovered yet? What if marriage changed us? What if the differences that seemed manageable now became serious later? What if I ignored warning signs because I wanted the relationship to succeed? The questions arrived one after another. Sometimes I felt like I was interviewing myself for a position I was not sure I wanted. Meanwhile, life continued moving forward. Wedding planning became more intense. Family members asked for updates. Friends shared advice. Everyone seemed excited. Occasionally, their excitement made me feel guilty. Why was I struggling when I should have been celebrating? Why was I analyzing every detail while everyone else appeared confident? Then one evening, something happened that surprised me. I attended a small gathering where several married couples were discussing relationships. Most of them had been married for many years. I expected to hear stories about certainty and confidence. Instead, I heard something completely different. One woman laughed and admitted that she had questioned her decision right up until her wedding day. Another man confessed that he had spent weeks worrying whether he was ready for marriage. A third couple explained that they nearly canceled their wedding because they were terrified of making the wrong choice. I sat there quietly, listening. The more they spoke, the more relieved I felt. Not because their experiences matched mine exactly. Because they revealed something important. Doubt was not necessarily evidence of a bad decision. Sometimes doubt was simply evidence that a person understood the seriousness of the decision. That realization helped, but it did not eliminate my concerns entirely. A few days later, I experienced another sleepless night. This one felt different. Instead of trying to force myself to stop worrying, I decided to examine the worries directly. I grabbed a notebook and began writing. On one side of the page, I listed reasons I believed we could build a happy life together. On the other side, I listed every concern I could think of. At first, the exercise felt strange. Then something interesting happened. Patterns began appearing. Most of my fears were not about who he was. They were about uncertainty itself. I was afraid of making a permanent decision in an unpredictable world. I was afraid of future problems that had not happened. I was afraid of losing the life I had imagined if things went wrong. In other words, I was afraid of risk. The problem was that every meaningful relationship involves risk. There is no version of love that comes with guaranteed outcomes. No contract promises perfect happiness. No expert can eliminate uncertainty completely. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that certainty had never really existed. I had simply assumed it did. Yet another question remained. If uncertainty is normal, how do people know when to move forward? That question stayed with me until a conversation changed everything. One weekend, I met an older neighbor who had been married for more than 40 years. After listening to some of my concerns, she smiled and said something unexpectedly simple. People spend too much time asking whether they found the right person and not enough time asking whether they are willing to become the right partner. I remember staring at her for several seconds. The idea felt almost too simple. Yet the more I considered it, the more powerful it became. I had been treating marriage like a final exam. Pass or fail. Right or wrong. Success or disaster. She described it differently. She described it as a continuing process of growth, communication, patience, and commitment. Not perfection. Not certainty. Commitment. That conversation stayed with me for days. Gradually, my perspective began shifting. Instead of focusing exclusively on future risks, I started paying attention to present realities. Did we communicate honestly? Usually, yes. Did we respect each other? Absolutely. Were we willing to work through disagreements? Most of the time. Were we perfect? Not even close. But perhaps perfection had never been the goal. Then, just as I began feeling slightly calmer, another challenge appeared. One evening, during what should have been an ordinary conversation, we disagreed about a topic neither of us expected to become emotional. The discussion escalated more quickly than usual. Nothing dramatic happened, but the tension lingered longer than before. Afterward, I found myself wondering whether the universe was trying to send me a message. Was this another warning sign? Or was it simply another example of two imperfect people learning how to build a future together? Once again, the answer was unclear. That uncertainty followed me into another sleepless night. Yet this time something felt different. The fear was still present, but curiosity had started replacing panic. Instead of asking, what if everything goes wrong? I found myself asking, what if we are stronger than I think? The shift was subtle, but important. Fear focuses on catastrophe. Curiosity explores possibility. As I stared into the darkness that night, I realized something surprising. My biggest concern was no longer whether I loved him. It was whether I trusted our ability to face challenges together. And soon, life was about to give us a test that would reveal the answer in a way neither of us expected. The result would change the course of our relationship and force us to confront truths we could no longer avoid. Lessons from an American family. Sometimes the answers we spend months searching for arrive in places we never expected. I thought I would find clarity by reading relationship articles, listening to advice from friends, or analyzing every detail of my engagement. Instead, some of the most important lessons came from sitting around a dinner table with people I barely knew when this story began. They were his family. Before meeting them, I carried a quiet fear. Not because they had done anything wrong, Because meeting a future spouse's family feels a little like walking into a room where everyone already knows the rules except you. Add cultural differences, language differences, and the pressure of being engaged, and the experience can feel even more intimidating. I worried about everything. Would they like me? Would I accidentally say something awkward? Would I understand their jokes? Would I fit into their family traditions? Those concerns followed me all the way to their home on the outskirts of a small American town. The neighborhood looked exactly like something from a movie. Wide streets. Green lawns. Children riding bicycles. American flags hanging from porches. It felt peaceful, almost unreal. As we pulled into the driveway, my stomach tightened. He noticed immediately and smiled. "You'll be fine," he said. Simple words. Yet they did not eliminate my nerves. When we entered the house, however, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling judged, I felt welcomed. His mother greeted me with a warm hug. His father shook my hand and immediately started asking questions about my experiences living in America. His younger sister joked about how nervous he looked during the proposal. Within minutes, the atmosphere felt less like an interview and more like a gathering of people genuinely interested in one another. That evening we sat around a large dining table filled with food, laughter, and stories. One conversation led to another. Childhood memories became family jokes. Family jokes became life lessons. Life lessons became surprisingly deep discussions about marriage. At one point, his parents began sharing stories from their own relationship. They had been married for more than 30 years. Looking at them, I expected to hear a romantic story filled with certainty and perfect compatibility. Instead, they told a very different story. They described disagreements, financial struggles, career changes, moves across different states, periods of stress, moments when life became difficult. What surprised me most was how casually they discussed those challenges. There was no embarrassment. No attempt to pretend everything had always been easy. They spoke about difficulties the same way experienced travelers discuss storms they survived years ago. One statement from his father immediately caught my attention. He laughed and said, "The secret isn't finding someone you never disagree with. The secret is finding someone you still choose when you do disagree." Everyone at the table nodded as if he had repeated a well-known truth. I sat quietly, absorbing every word. Researchers who study long-term relationships often reach a similar conclusion. Successful couples are not distinguished by the absence of conflict. They are distinguished by their ability to repair connection after conflict occurs. Hearing that idea from psychologists is one thing. Watching it reflected in a real marriage lasting decades is something entirely different. Throughout the weekend, I observed countless small interactions. Nothing dramatic. In fact, the ordinary moments taught me the most. His parents occasionally interrupted each other. They sometimes disagreed about details. They teased one another about old habits. Yet beneath those interactions was something deeper. Respect. Patience. Familiarity. Trust. It was not a perfect relationship. It was a practiced relationship. That distinction changed the way I viewed marriage. Before then, I had unconsciously treated compatibility as the most important factor. Their example suggested something different. Compatibility mattered, of course. But commitment, communication, and mutual effort seemed equally important. Then another conversation shifted my perspective even further. One afternoon, I was helping his mother prepare lunch. While we worked in the kitchen, she asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Are you scared?" she said gently. For a moment, I considered giving a polite answer. Then I decided to be honest. "Yes," I admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm making the right decision." Instead of looking surprised, she smiled. "Good," she replied. I stared at her, confused. "Good?" That was not the response I expected. She laughed softly before explaining. People who take marriage seriously usually feel some fear. It means they understand the responsibility. The dangerous people are often the ones who think marriage requires no effort at all. Her words stayed with me for the rest of the day. They challenged one of my biggest assumptions. I had been treating fear as evidence that something was wrong. She suggested fear could also be evidence that something mattered. That idea changed everything. Later that evening, another lesson arrived unexpectedly. Several relatives gathered for a family barbecue. Conversations drifted from sports to careers to parenting. Eventually the topic turned toward marriage again. One older relative shared an observation I have never forgotten. "Love starts relationships," he said. "But habits shape them." At first, the statement sounded simple. Then he explained further. Daily kindness becomes a habit. Listening becomes a habit. Respect becomes a habit. So does criticism. So does avoidance. So does resentment. Over time, those habits quietly build the environment where a marriage either thrives or struggles. The concept fascinated me because it aligned with research I had encountered before. Behavioral scientists frequently emphasize that long-term outcomes are often determined by small repeated actions rather than occasional dramatic efforts. In other words, a successful marriage may depend less on grand romantic gestures and more on ordinary daily choices. As the weekend continued, I noticed another interesting aspect of American family culture. Individual independence was valued, yet family support remained strong. Adult children pursued their own paths, but family gatherings still mattered. Different opinions existed, but relationships endured. Watching those dynamics helped me understand my fiancé more clearly. Many of his values suddenly made sense. The way he approached responsibility. The way he handled disagreements. The importance he placed on honesty. Those characteristics did not appear randomly. They had been shaped over years within this family environment. By the time the weekend ended, something inside me had shifted. The doubts had not disappeared completely. I was still uncertain about certain aspects of the future. But I no longer felt trapped by those uncertainties. Instead, I felt curious. Hopeful, even. For the first time in months, I stopped asking whether our relationship was perfect. I started asking whether it was strong enough to keep growing. Yet life has a strange sense of timing. Just when I began feeling more confident about our future, another challenge was quietly approaching. A challenge that would test not only our relationship, but everything I had learned from those conversations around the family table. And unlike the doubts that had kept me awake at night, this challenge would be impossible to solve with reflection alone. Distance under the same roof. One of the biggest surprises of adult life is discovering that two people can sit in the same room, share the same home, eat the same dinner, and still feel miles apart. Before our engagement, I believed that distance only existed between people who rarely saw each other. What I eventually learned was far more complicated. Emotional distance can quietly appear even when two people spend every day together. And when it does, it often arrives so gradually that neither person notices until the gap has already become significant. The challenge I mentioned at the end of the last chapter did not arrive as a dramatic crisis. No shocking betrayal. No explosive argument. No life-changing disaster. Instead, it arrived disguised as ordinary life. The most dangerous problems often do. As our wedding plans became more serious, responsibilities increased. Work became busier. Expenses increased. Decisions multiplied. Every week seemed to introduce another task requiring our attention. At first, we handled everything reasonably well. We created schedules. We discussed budgets. We divided responsibilities. On paper, everything looked organized. Yet beneath that organization, tension was quietly growing. It began with small disagreements about money. Nothing unusual. In fact, financial discussions are among the most common sources of conflict in relationships. Researchers consistently find that couples often bring different beliefs, habits, and emotional experiences into conversations about finances. Looking back, I can see that we were no exception. I tended to view money as a tool for creating experiences and security. He viewed money as something that should be carefully protected and strategically managed. Neither perspective was wrong. Yet those differences occasionally produced friction. One evening, we sat together reviewing wedding expenses. What should have been a simple discussion slowly became frustrating. Every suggestion seemed to generate another concern. Every compromise seemed incomplete. By the end of the conversation, neither of us felt understood. The disagreement itself was not particularly serious. What bothered me was the feeling that we were speaking different languages despite using the same words. That feeling continued appearing in other areas of our lives. Sometimes it involved finances. Sometimes it involved career goals. Sometimes it involved how we spent our free time. Individually, each issue seemed manageable. Together, they created a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Around that period, something else began changing. Before our engagement, we had naturally shared our thoughts and feelings throughout the day. Now those conversations seemed less frequent. Not because we stopped caring. Because life became crowded. Work deadlines replaced long conversations. Responsibilities replaced spontaneity. Fatigue replaced curiosity. Relationship experts often describe this phenomenon as emotional drift. It does not happen because two people suddenly stop loving each other. It happens because attention gradually shifts elsewhere. The relationship remains important, but daily demands slowly move to the front of the line. One night, after another long day, I found myself sitting across from him during dinner. The television was on. Both of us were tired. Neither of us was upset. Yet something felt wrong. We exchanged a few comments about our day. We discussed practical tasks. We talked about schedules. Then silence filled the room. Not comfortable silence. Heavy silence. The kind that quietly asks questions nobody wants to answer. I remember looking at him and thinking something that immediately frightened me. How could someone I loved so deeply suddenly feel so far away? The realization lingered long after dinner ended. That night, I struggled to sleep. My thoughts returned to the same concern repeatedly. Were these normal challenges? Or were they warning signs of deeper incompatibility? Once again, uncertainty returned. Yet this time it felt more serious because it was connected to real experiences rather than hypothetical fears. A few days later, another situation intensified my concerns. We had planned a weekend together after an especially busy week. I looked forward to it. In my mind, it was an opportunity to reconnect. Unfortunately, life had different plans. Unexpected work issues appeared. Stress levels increased. By Saturday afternoon, both of us were frustrated. What should have been an enjoyable day turned into a sequence of minor irritations. A delayed appointment. A misunderstanding about plans. A disagreement about priorities. None of those events mattered individually. Yet together they created tension that neither of us handled particularly well. At one point, we found ourselves sitting in complete silence during a car ride. The atmosphere felt unusually cold. I stared out the window, wondering how we had arrived at this moment. Several months earlier, spending time together had felt effortless. Now even simple interactions sometimes required effort. The contrast worried me. Human psychology contains an interesting bias called negativity bias. Our brains naturally pay more attention to problems than positive experiences. Evolution shaped us that way because identifying threats helped our ancestors survive. The downside is that modern relationships can become distorted through the same mechanism. 10 positive interactions may occur unnoticed while one negative interaction dominates attention. Unfortunately, I did not understand that clearly at the time. My mind focused almost entirely on our struggles. Every disagreement felt significant. Every awkward conversation seemed meaningful. Every moment of distance appeared larger than it actually was. Then something happened that forced me to examine the situation differently. One evening, after another frustrating day, I decided to review old photos from the beginning of our relationship. I expected nostalgia. Instead, I discovered perspective. The pictures reminded me of experiences I had temporarily forgotten. The road trips. The laughter. The conversations. The support during difficult moments. The countless examples of kindness and connection that had helped build our relationship. Suddenly, a realization emerged. I had become so focused on current challenges that I was ignoring the larger story. The relationship was not defined solely by recent difficulties. Yet even that realization failed to eliminate the underlying problem. We were still struggling. We were still drifting. And neither of us seemed completely sure how to close the growing emotional distance. Then one night, after weeks of tension, we finally had a conversation neither of us could avoid any longer. It started unexpectedly. No dramatic introduction. No prepared speeches. Just honesty. Real honesty. The kind that feels uncomfortable because it leaves no place to hide. We admitted our frustrations. We discussed our fears. We acknowledged the distance that had developed between us. Some parts of the conversation were painful. Other parts were surprisingly relieving. For the first time in weeks, it felt like we were discussing the actual problem rather than the symptoms surrounding it. Yet even as the conversation ended, neither of us knew whether it would be enough. The distance had not appeared overnight. It would not disappear overnight either. What we did not realize was that life was preparing an even greater test. A test that would force us to choose between protecting ourselves and fighting for the relationship we had worked so hard to build. And when that moment arrived, neither of us would be able to avoid the truth any longer. The moment we almost gave up. Most people imagine that relationships end because of one terrible event. A betrayal. A shocking secret. A dramatic argument that changes everything overnight. Real life is often less dramatic and far more complicated. Sometimes relationships reach a breaking point not because of one giant mistake, but because of hundreds of small disappointments that quietly accumulate over time. That was the lesson waiting for us. And when it finally arrived, it forced us to confront a question neither of us wanted to answer. Were we truly building a future together, or were we simply trying to protect a dream that no longer matched reality? Looking back now, I can identify the exact season when things became especially difficult. The wedding plans were progressing. Work responsibilities were increasing. Financial pressures continued growing. Friends and family kept asking about our future. Ironically, the more people celebrated our relationship, the more exhausted we became behind the scenes. We were carrying expectations from every direction. Some expectations came from others. Many came from ourselves. We wanted to be successful. We wanted to be responsible. We wanted to be the kind of couple everyone believed we were. The problem was that maintaining an image requires energy. Building a healthy relationship requires even more. Eventually something had to give. At first, the changes seemed subtle. Conversations became shorter. Patience became thinner. Small misunderstandings lasted longer than they should have. Situations that once produced laughter now produced irritation. The most frightening part was not the conflict itself. It was the emotional distance growing underneath it. Researchers often describe emotional connection as a kind of relationship currency. Couples invest attention, trust, affection, and understanding into a shared emotional account. When life becomes stressful, withdrawals increase. If deposits stop for too long, the account eventually becomes depleted. At the time, neither of us understood how much we had been withdrawing without replenishing. Then came the week that changed everything. It began with a problem at work. A major project created unexpected stress. Deadlines tightened. Long hours became normal. Sleep became inconsistent. My energy disappeared. Meanwhile, he was dealing with challenges of his own. Financial concerns. Career uncertainty. Family obligations. Both of us were struggling, but instead of moving closer together, we were drifting further apart. One evening, after an especially difficult day, we sat down to discuss a practical issue involving our future plans. Under normal circumstances, the conversation would have been manageable. But stress has a strange way of turning ordinary discussions into emotional minefields. A simple disagreement quickly expanded into something much larger. One topic became another. Then another. Soon we were no longer discussing the original issue at all. We were discussing months of accumulated frustration. Feelings that had remained unspoken suddenly emerged. Expectations surfaced. Disappointments surfaced. Fears surfaced. For the first time in our relationship, neither of us seemed capable of finding common ground. The conversation lasted hours. At several points, silence filled the room. Not thoughtful silence. Painful silence. The kind that appears when people no longer know what to say. I remember looking at him and realizing something terrifying. We were both hurting, yet neither of us knew how to help the other person. Sometimes emotional pain creates connection. Other times it creates isolation. That night, it felt like isolation. Eventually, the conversation ended. Not because we solved anything. Because we were exhausted. He went into another room. I stayed where I was. The apartment felt strangely unfamiliar. Everything looked the same. Yet nothing felt the same. Hours passed. Sleep never arrived. Instead, my mind replayed every difficult moment from the previous months. Every disagreement. Every misunderstanding. Every doubt. Negativity bias, once again, became the loudest voice in the room. Human beings often evaluate entire relationships based on recent experiences, especially during periods of stress. Psychologists call this recency bias. Recent emotions can distort our perception of the larger picture. Unfortunately, that night I was experiencing exactly that. The future suddenly looked uncertain. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had avoided for months. What if we were not meant to be together? The thought felt devastating. Yet it also felt strangely logical in that moment. If love was supposed to feel easy, why was this so difficult? If we were right for each other, why were we struggling so much? The questions kept coming. Then something happened that I never expected. The following day, after another tense interaction, one of us said words neither of us thought we would ever say. Maybe we should postpone everything. The room became completely silent. Those words carried enormous weight. They were not a breakup. Yet they were not far from one either. Postponing the wedding meant acknowledging that something serious was wrong. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I could hear my heartbeat. I could feel fear spreading through my chest. This was no longer theoretical uncertainty. This was reality. The future we had spent months planning suddenly seemed fragile. What surprised me most was not the suggestion itself. It was my reaction. Instead of feeling relief, I felt grief. Genuine grief. In that instant, I realized something important. Beneath all the frustration, confusion, and conflict, I still wanted us to succeed. Deeply. The possibility of losing the relationship hurt far more than the challenges we were facing inside it. That realization changed everything. Later that evening, I went for a long walk alone. The air was cool. The streets were quiet. As I walked, memories surfaced one after another. The day we met. The road trips. The conversations. The support we had given each other during difficult times. The family weekend. The laughter. The countless moments that had brought us here. Gradually, another realization emerged. We were treating our relationship as the problem. But what if the real problem was how we were responding to stress? What if exhaustion, fear, and pressure had become the enemy rather than each other? Relationship researchers frequently emphasize that successful couples learn to view challenges as shared problems rather than personal battles. The distinction sounds simple. In practice, it is incredibly difficult. Especially when emotions are running high. That night, for the first time in weeks, I stopped focusing on who was right and who was wrong. I started focusing on what we were trying to protect. The answer was obvious. We were trying to protect us. The next day, we agreed to have one more conversation. Not about wedding plans. Not about finances. Not about responsibilities. About us. What followed became one of the most important discussions of our entire relationship. It was honest, uncomfortable, emotional, and ultimately transformative. Yet neither of us knew that at the time. All we knew was that we had reached a crossroads. One path led toward separation. The other required vulnerability, accountability, and a level of honesty that felt almost terrifying. What happened next would determine whether our story ended before it truly began or whether we would finally learn how to fight for each other instead of against each other. Learning how to truly listen. Most people believe communication means talking. That sounds reasonable until you discover that two people can talk for hours and still completely misunderstand each other. That realization became one of the most important turning points in our relationship. After the difficult period that nearly pushed us apart, we finally reached a moment where neither of us wanted another argument, another misunderstanding, or another night spent wondering whether our future was slipping away. We were tired. Not tired of each other. Tired of feeling disconnected from each other. There is a significant difference. The conversation we had agreed to hold after our near breaking point happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon. No phones. No television. No distractions. Just two people sitting across from each other, carrying months of fears, frustrations, hopes, and unanswered questions. Looking back, I realize how unusual that moment was. In modern life, genuine conversations are surprisingly rare. People often listen while preparing responses. They hear words without hearing meaning. They focus on defending themselves rather than understanding the other person. We had fallen into that pattern without realizing it. Now we were about to confront it directly. The conversation began awkwardly. Neither of us knew where to start. For several minutes, the room felt heavy with anticipation. Then he said something simple that immediately changed the atmosphere. "I don't want to win this conversation," he said. "I want to understand what we've been missing." Those words caught me completely off guard. Until that moment, I had unconsciously approached many of our difficult discussions as problems to solve. He was approaching this one differently. He was treating it as an opportunity to learn. That shift mattered more than I realized at the time. Researchers who study healthy relationships often identify curiosity as one of the most powerful tools for connection. Curiosity encourages people to ask questions instead of making assumptions. It creates space for discovery rather than judgment. Without knowing it, we were about to practice exactly that. For the next several hours, we talked. Really talked. Not about wedding details. Not about schedules. Not about responsibilities. We talked about emotions, fears, expectations, experiences, the invisible things hiding underneath our conflicts. I admitted that I often worried about making the wrong decision. Not because I doubted my feelings for him, but because marriage felt enormous, permanent, life-changing. Sometimes that responsibility overwhelmed me. He listened without interrupting. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply listened. Then he shared something I had never fully understood before. Many of the moments I interpreted as emotional distance were actually moments when he felt overwhelmed and uncertain. While I was seeking conversation, he was seeking time to process. Neither approach was wrong. Yet our different coping styles had repeatedly created misunderstandings. Suddenly, several months of confusion began making sense. Psychologists often describe this phenomenon as attribution error. People naturally explain their own behavior based on circumstances while explaining other people's behavior based on character. When I withdrew, I believed I was stressed. When he withdrew, I assumed he was becoming distant. When he needed space, he viewed it as emotional processing. When I needed conversation, I viewed it as emotional connection. We were interpreting identical situations through completely different lenses. Once we recognized that pattern, something remarkable happened. Defensiveness began disappearing. Curiosity replaced it. Instead of asking, "Why are you doing this?" we started asking, "What are you experiencing right now?" The difference may seem small. In reality, it transformed everything. Then another breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. At one point during the discussion, we each described what love looked like from our perspective. My answers focused heavily on communication, emotional openness, and shared experiences. His answers focused on reliability, responsibility, and consistency. Neither definition was better than the other. They were simply different. Yet those differences explained countless misunderstandings. Sometimes he expressed love through actions while I was searching for words. Sometimes I expressed love through conversation while he was focusing on practical support. We were both trying to care for each other. We were simply speaking different emotional languages. Relationship experts often refer to this concept as love languages or emotional preferences. The terminology matters less than the underlying truth. People frequently give love the way they prefer to receive it. Problems arise when partners assume everyone experiences connection in the same way. The more we explored these differences, the more our past conflicts began looking less like incompatibility and more like miscommunication. That realization was both comforting and frustrating. Comforting because many of our challenges were solvable. Frustrating because we could have addressed them earlier if we had understood each other better. Yet perhaps understanding arrives only when people become ready to receive it. One of the most meaningful moments happened near the end of the conversation. After hours of honesty, vulnerability, and reflection, he asked me a question. "When did you start feeling alone?" The room became completely silent. It was not an easy question. I thought carefully before answering. Then I described the gradual distance that had developed during months of stress. The loneliness. The uncertainty. The fear of losing connection. As I spoke, I noticed something unexpected. He looked genuinely surprised. Not because he doubted my experience. Because he had been feeling something remarkably similar. For months, both of us had assumed we were carrying these burdens alone. In reality, we were standing on opposite sides of the same wall, each wondering why the other person seemed distant. The irony was almost laughable. Two people desperately wanting connection had accidentally created separation while trying to protect themselves from disappointment. Human relationships are full of such contradictions. By the time the conversation ended, nothing external had changed. We still faced financial challenges. Wedding planning still required attention. Future uncertainties still existed. Yet everything felt different. The emotional distance that had once seemed impossible to cross suddenly felt manageable. Not because we had solved every problem. Because we had rediscovered each other. Over the following weeks, we began implementing small changes. We scheduled regular check-ins. We practiced active listening. We asked more questions and made fewer assumptions. Progress was not perfect. Sometimes old habits returned. Sometimes misunderstandings still happened. Yet now we recognized them more quickly. Gradually, trust deepened. Communication improved. The relationship became stronger. Interestingly, many studies on long-term relationships suggest that successful couples are not defined by perfection. They are defined by repair. Conflict remains inevitable. The ability to reconnect afterward becomes the crucial skill. For the first time, I felt like we were developing that skill together. Looking back, that period taught me something I will never forget. Listening is not simply hearing words. It is temporarily setting aside your own story long enough to understand someone else's. It is one of the most difficult acts of love because it requires humility. Yet it may also be one of the most powerful. As our connection strengthened, hope returned. The future no longer felt like a threat waiting to happen. It felt like a possibility worth exploring. Neither of us knew it then, but an entirely new chapter was approaching. A chapter filled with joy, exhaustion, unexpected challenges, and a tiny new person who would soon change our lives forever. Welcoming a new life. There is a strange moment that happens in many people's lives when the future suddenly stops feeling like an idea and starts feeling real. For some people, it happens when they graduate. For others, it happens when they buy a home or begin a new career. For me, that moment arrived on an ordinary afternoon in America with 2 small lines appearing on a simple test. 2 lines. That was all. Yet somehow those 2 lines carried enough power to change every plan, every priority, and every dream we had for the future. Looking back, I sometimes laugh at how confident I thought I was before that day. I believed I understood responsibility. I believed I understood commitment. Then I learned we were going to become parents. Suddenly, every definition I had for those words expanded overnight. I remember staring at the test for several seconds, convinced I must be reading it incorrectly. Then I checked again. And again. The result never changed. My heart raced. Excitement arrived first. Then happiness. Then fear. Then excitement again. Human emotions rarely stand in an orderly line. They tend to arrive all at once. When I told him, his reaction was unforgettable. For a brief moment, he looked completely frozen. Then he smiled. Then laughed. Then looked terrified. Then smiled again. It was probably the most honest emotional response I had ever seen. We sat together for a long time, saying very little. The reality felt too large for immediate conversation. Everything we had discussed during the previous years suddenly gained new meaning. The future was no longer a distant concept. It was arriving. Fast. Researchers often describe major life transitions as identity shifts. Becoming a parent is one of the most significant examples. It changes schedules, priorities, relationships, and even self-perception. At the time, however, I was not thinking about psychology. I was thinking about diapers, hospitals, finances, sleep, responsibility, and whether any human being could truly feel prepared for such a massive change. The months that followed were unlike anything I had experienced before. Some days felt magical. Other days felt overwhelming. Pregnancy introduced new emotions, new routines, and new challenges. Even ordinary activities began feeling different. Grocery shopping became strategic planning. Doctor appointments became major events. Conversations about the future became increasingly detailed. One of the most interesting things about this period was how it affected our relationship. For years, we had been focused primarily on understanding each other. Now we were preparing to care for someone else entirely. That shift changed our perspective. Many disagreements that once seemed important suddenly felt smaller. Not because the problems disappeared. Because something larger demanded our attention. Yet parenthood preparation was not purely romantic or inspirational. It was also exhausting. There were financial calculations, housing considerations, work adjustments, medical appointments, endless decisions. We quickly discovered that babies require planning long before they arrive. At one point, our dining table looked less like a place for meals and more like a project management center. Lists covered every surface. Budgets appeared everywhere. We discussed topics I had never imagined discussing in such detail. Strollers, cribs, car seats, baby monitors. The amount of information available to new parents seemed almost endless. Sometimes it felt as though the entire world was trying to sell us products designed to solve problems we did not yet understand. Despite the stress, something beautiful was happening beneath the surface. We were becoming a team in a new way. The communication skills we had developed during our difficult period were finally being tested. And surprisingly, they held up well. When disagreements appeared, we addressed them earlier. When concerns emerged, we discussed them more openly. We were far from perfect, but we were improving. Then came one of my favorite memories from that year. One evening, we were assembling furniture for the nursery. The project should have taken 2 hours. Instead, it consumed nearly an entire day. Instructions seemed written in another language. Screws disappeared mysteriously. Pieces ended up in the wrong places. At one point, we genuinely questioned whether the furniture company had forgotten half the parts. Looking back, it was absurd. Yet we laughed more that day than we had in weeks. Sometimes happiness arrives disguised as incompetence. The nursery slowly took shape. A crib appeared. Decorations appeared. Tiny clothes filled drawers. Every small addition made the future feel more real. And strangely, more emotional. One afternoon, while organizing baby clothes, I suddenly became overwhelmed. The tiny socks. The tiny shirts. The tiny blankets. Everything seemed impossibly small. Yet they represented someone who would soon become the center of our world. Tears appeared unexpectedly. Not from sadness. From the realization that life was changing again. This time in the most profound way imaginable. Scientists often note that anticipation activates many of the same emotional systems as actual experiences. In simple terms, people begin adapting to parenthood before the child even arrives. Looking back, I can see that process happening within both of us. We were already changing. Already growing. Already becoming different versions of ourselves. Then came the day that neither of us will ever forget. The hospital room. The bright lights. The nervous anticipation. The overwhelming mixture of excitement and fear. Hours seemed to move simultaneously, too slowly and too quickly. Every emotion felt amplified. Every moment felt important. Then suddenly, after all the waiting, all the preparation, and all the uncertainty, our child entered the world. I wish I could perfectly describe that moment. I cannot. Some experiences resist language. I remember hearing the first cry. I remember seeing tears in his eyes. I remember feeling a love so immediate and powerful that it seemed to rearrange my understanding of everything. Nothing in my life had prepared me for that feeling. The days that followed were beautiful. They were also chaotic. Sleep became rare. Schedules disappeared. Fatigue became a constant companion. Yet beneath the exhaustion was an extraordinary sense of purpose. We were no longer imagining a family. We were living as one. Of course, new challenges appeared almost immediately. Parenthood introduced pressures we had never experienced before. Less sleep. More responsibility. Greater stress. Yet it also revealed strengths we did not know we possessed. As we adjusted to this new chapter, I found myself thinking about the question that had haunted me years earlier. Had I said yes too quickly? At that moment, holding our child in my arms, the answer seemed both clearer and more complicated than ever before. Because the story was no longer just about a proposal, a wedding, or even a marriage. It had become a story about growth, resilience, family, and the unexpected ways life teaches us what truly matters. And soon, as the years continued passing, I would finally understand what that quick yes had really meant. Looking back at that quick yes. Time has a fascinating way of changing the meaning of old memories. A moment that once felt confusing can later seem obvious. A decision that once felt risky can eventually become the reason an entirely different life exists. Years after our wedding, years after the sleepless nights, the doubts, the disagreements, and the unexpected challenges, I found myself standing in our backyard on a quiet summer evening in America, watching our children run through the grass while the sun slowly disappeared behind the trees. It was one of those ordinary moments that somehow feels extraordinary while it is happening. Laughter filled the air. A gentle breeze moved through the yard. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor was grilling dinner. The scene was simple. Yet as I watched my family together, a question returned to my mind. The same question that had followed me throughout this entire journey. Had I said yes too quickly? The funny thing about life is that it rarely gives simple answers to complicated questions. If someone asked me whether our marriage had been easy, I would honestly say no. If someone asked whether we had faced challenges, I would say absolutely. If someone asked whether there were moments when I questioned our future, I would say more than once. Yet if someone asked whether I regretted saying yes, my answer would be equally clear. No. Not because everything turned out perfectly. Because perfection was never the point. Looking back, I realized that one of the biggest mistakes people make when evaluating life decisions is assuming they should judge the decision by the difficulty of the journey rather than the growth it creates. Human beings naturally prefer comfort. We want certainty. We want guarantees. We want proof that our choices will lead to happiness before we make them. Unfortunately, life does not operate that way. Most meaningful decisions come wrapped in uncertainty. Marriage is no exception. One evening, while helping my son with his homework, I experienced a moment that unexpectedly connected the past and present. He was struggling with a problem and becoming frustrated. After several attempts, he looked at me and said, "What if I get it wrong?" I smiled because the question sounded strangely familiar. Not the homework question. The fear behind it. The fear of making mistakes. The fear of choosing incorrectly. The fear of failure. It was the same fear that had once kept me awake at night during my engagement. I told him something simple. Getting it wrong isn't always the worst outcome. Sometimes not trying is worse. He nodded and returned to his work. The conversation lasted less than a minute. Yet after he walked away, I sat quietly for a long time. Because I realized I was speaking not only to him. I was speaking to the younger version of myself. The version that spent months searching for certainty before moving forward. Researchers studying decision-making often explain that humans suffer from what psychologists call anticipated regret. People frequently avoid choices because they fear future disappointment. Ironically, this strategy sometimes creates even greater regret later. We become so focused on avoiding mistakes that we miss opportunities for growth. Looking back at my own story, I can see that pattern clearly. Many of my fears before marriage were rooted in a desire to eliminate risk completely. The problem was that no such option existed. Every path carried uncertainty. Saying yes involved risk. Saying no involved risk. Waiting involved risk. Life itself involved risk. The real challenge was never choosing the option with zero uncertainty. The real challenge was choosing which uncertainty was worth facing. As our children grew older, new chapters appeared. School events. Family vacations. Soccer games. Birthday celebrations. Late-night conversations around the dinner table. Ordinary experiences gradually accumulated into years of memories. Some moments were joyful. Others were difficult. Parenting introduced new challenges that neither of us could have predicted. There were stressful periods. Financial pressures. Health concerns. Unexpected setbacks. Yet something interesting happened during those years. Every challenge that once seemed capable of breaking us gradually became another shared memory instead. Relationship researchers often note that couples build resilience through successfully navigating adversity together. In simple terms, surviving challenges can strengthen confidence in the relationship itself. We experienced that firsthand. Problems still appeared, but they no longer felt like threats to the relationship. They felt like problems we would solve together. One rainy afternoon, many years after our wedding, I discovered an old box while cleaning a closet. Inside were engagement photos, wedding plans, handwritten notes, and documents from that chapter of our lives. Curious, I sat down and began looking through them. Then I found something unexpected. A notebook. The same notebook where I had once written lists of fears and concerns during those sleepless nights before marriage. My heart immediately became curious. I opened the notebook and began reading. Page after page contained worries that had once felt enormous. Questions about compatibility. Questions about the future. Questions about whether we were making the right decision. Some concerns had been valid. Others now seemed almost funny. Several fears never happened at all. A few challenges arrived in forms I never predicted. As I continued reading, I noticed something remarkable. The notebook revealed not only my fears. It revealed my growth. The person writing those pages was trying desperately to predict the future. The person reading those pages finally understood that the future cannot be predicted with complete accuracy. It can only be lived. That realization felt strangely emotional. We spend so much time trying to control uncertainty that we sometimes forget uncertainty is also where possibility lives. Without uncertainty, there would be no surprises, no discoveries, no unexpected joys, no opportunities to become more than we currently are. Later that evening, I showed the notebook to my husband. We laughed at some of the entries. We discussed old memories. We remembered arguments that seemed catastrophic at the time and almost comical years later. Then he looked at me and asked a question. If you could go back, would you still say yes? I smiled immediately. Not because the answer was easy. Because it was honest. Yes, I said. But this time I would understand what yes actually means. Years earlier, I thought yes meant certainty. I thought yes meant confidence. I thought yes meant believing everything would work out exactly as planned. Experience taught me something different. Yes means choosing someone even when certainty is unavailable. Yes means growing together instead of expecting perfection. Yes means understanding that love is not a destination you arrive at once. It is something you continue building day after day, year after year. As the evening grew darker and our children called us from another room, I realized something else. The question that started this entire story was finally losing its power. Not because it had been answered perfectly. Because life itself had become the answer. And yet, one final realization remained. The most important lesson of all was still waiting to be discovered. The real meaning of saying yes. If you have stayed with this story from the beginning, you might think the biggest question was whether I said yes too quickly. For a long time, I believed that was the central mystery too. It followed me through our engagement, through sleepless nights, through disagreements, through wedding plans, through parenthood, and through years of marriage. It seemed like the question hiding behind every challenge. Was saying yes a mistake? Yet life has a remarkable way of revealing that the questions we ask at the beginning of a journey are not always the questions that matter most at the end. Years passed. Seasons changed. Our children grew taller. Family photographs slowly filled the walls of our home. New memories replaced old worries. Some dreams came true exactly as we imagined. Others arrived in forms we never expected. That is the strange beauty of life. Reality rarely follows the script we create in advance. And perhaps that is exactly why it becomes meaningful. One autumn evening, after another busy day, I found myself sitting alone on the back porch while the rest of the family slept. The air was cool. Leaves drifted across the yard. The neighborhood was quiet except for the occasional sound of distant traffic. Moments like that often invite reflection. With no distractions and no responsibilities demanding immediate attention, the mind naturally begins reviewing old chapters. As I sat there, I thought about the younger version of myself who had once stared at an engagement ring while wondering whether fear was trying to protect me or simply trying to control me. I remembered the uncertainty, the anxiety, the endless search for guarantees. I remembered believing that successful relationships were built by people who somehow possessed more confidence, more certainty, or better instincts than everyone else. Experience eventually taught me something very different. The strongest relationships are rarely built by people who never feel doubt. They are built by people who continue moving forward despite doubt. Psychologists often describe courage as action in the presence of fear rather than the absence of fear. That definition changed the way I viewed my entire journey. For years, I treated fear as evidence that something was wrong. Now I understood that fear often appears whenever something important is at stake. The presence of fear does not automatically signal danger. Sometimes it simply signals significance. Looking back, many of my worries before marriage had less to do with my partner and more to do with uncertainty itself. I wanted guarantees that no human being could provide. I wanted certainty about the future. I wanted protection from disappointment. I wanted proof that every sacrifice would be worthwhile. The problem was that love has never offered those guarantees. Love offers possibility. It offers connection. It offers growth. But it also requires trust. Not trust that everything will go perfectly. Trust that two people can continue learning, adapting, and growing together even when life becomes difficult. That realization became even clearer through parenthood. Children have a unique way of exposing illusions. They do not care about your plans. They do not care about your schedules. They do not care about the perfect version of life you imagined years earlier. They simply arrive and invite you into reality. A beautiful, exhausting, unpredictable reality. Through raising our children, I learned lessons that no book, article, or expert could have taught me. I learned that patience is not something you possess. It is something you practice. I learned that love is often expressed through ordinary acts repeated consistently over time. I learned that resilience grows through challenges rather than comfort. Most importantly, I learned that family is not created in a single moment. It is created through thousands of small moments that gradually become a life together. One Saturday morning, years after the fears and doubts of our engagement had faded into memory, our family took a road trip through the American countryside. The children argued over music. Snacks disappeared faster than expected. We made several wrong turns. Nothing about the trip was perfect. Yet somewhere along a winding highway surrounded by fields and open sky, I suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not because life had become easy. Because life had become real. The younger version of me would probably have been surprised by what happiness actually looked like. Happiness was not constant excitement. It was not endless romance. It was not a life free from problems. Happiness looked more like shared experiences, mutual support, inside jokes, family traditions, quiet evenings, difficult conversations handled with care, and knowing that someone would remain beside you during both victories and setbacks. Researchers who study long-term well-being consistently find that meaningful relationships are among the strongest predictors of life satisfaction. Interestingly, those relationships are not defined by perfection. They are defined by connection. Looking at my own life, I understood why. The greatest moments were not necessarily the most glamorous. They were the moments of genuine connection. The moments when people showed up for one another. The moments when love became action instead of merely emotion. Eventually, I realized that the title of this story contains a hidden misunderstanding. I said yes too quickly. Was it a mistake? Assumes that the speed of the decision is the most important factor. In reality, the more important question is what happens after the decision. Relationships are not sustained by a single yes. They are sustained by thousands of additional yes. Yes to communication. Yes to patience. Yes to growth. Yes to forgiveness. Yes to learning. Yes to showing up even when life becomes difficult. Marriage is not one decision. It is a continuing series of decisions made over years. And perhaps that is why no proposal, no matter how romantic, can determine the success of a relationship by itself. The proposal begins the story. The daily choices write the chapters that follow. As I think about everything that happened, from arriving in America, to feeling lonely, to meeting him unexpectedly, to questioning my engagement, to nearly giving up, to rebuilding trust, to becoming parents, and finally to creating a family, I realized something beautiful. The answer to my original question was never yes or no. The answer was growth. The person who said yes years ago did not know exactly what the future would bring. Neither did he. Yet together we learned how to face that future anyway. And that, more than certainty, became the foundation of everything we built. So if you are listening to this story while learning English, while navigating your own relationship, while adjusting to a new country, or while facing a difficult decision, remember this. You do not need perfect certainty before taking meaningful steps forward. You do not need every answer before beginning a new chapter. Sometimes the path becomes visible only after you start walking. Sometimes understanding arrives after experience. Sometimes the question that keeps you awake at night eventually becomes the story that makes you smile years later. And sometimes a quick yes becomes the beginning of a beautiful life you could never have imagined. The future will always contain uncertainty. But uncertainty is not only where fear lives. It is also where hope lives. And in my experience, hope is usually worth the risk. Before you leave, I want you to think about one question. What if the biggest mistake in your life is not saying yes too quickly, but saying no because you were too afraid to begin? For years, I believed successful people had fewer doubts. I believed happy couples had fewer problems. I believed confident English speakers had less fear. I was wrong. The people who grow are not the people without fear. They are the people who keep moving while fear is sitting beside them. Maybe today you're learning English and feeling frustrated. Maybe you've started and stopped more times than you can count. Maybe you're afraid you'll never sound fluent. Maybe you're carrying questions about love, family, marriage, or your future. If that's you, remember this. Every fluent speaker once struggled to understand simple sentences. Every strong relationship once survived difficult conversations. Every happy ending began as an uncertain beginning. And every meaningful journey started with one small decision to continue. Tonight, after this video ends, don't focus on how far you still have to go. Focus on the fact that you're still here. Still learning. Still growing. Still trying. That matters more than you think. As for my story, the question was never really, did I say yes too quickly? The real question was, would I keep saying yes when life became difficult? Yes to growth. Yes to learning. Yes to forgiveness. Yes to courage. Yes to love. And maybe that's the secret behind every meaningful life. Not one big decision, but thousands of small decisions made with hope. If this story helped you practice English, improve your listening skills, or simply reminded you not to give up, leave a comment below and tell me. What is one decision that changed your life? I read as many comments as possible, and your story might inspire someone else around the world. And here's something exciting. The next story on this channel explores a completely different emotional journey, one unexpected choice, one life-changing secret, and a lesson that most people only understand years later. Trust me. You won't want to miss it. So if you enjoy slow English stories, English listening practice, English reading practice, and learn English through real-life stories, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and join our growing community of English learners from around the world. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Keep listening. Keep learning. Keep believing in your progress. And remember, Sometimes the chapter that changes your life begins with a sentence you were afraid to say. See you in the next story. Subscribe now and continue your English journey with us.